Shalom, HaDavar. Again, we want to welcome you to Lesson 1 of the Jewish Life of the Messiah class. We're in Session 4 of Lesson 1. So let's take a little bit of a review of where we've been. We've been looking at the concept of the Word of God from the point of view of Rabbinic theology and the biblical example from which they develop their points of view. Now we're going to switch over to the Gospel of John, and we're going to see how John incorporates 7 of these rabbinic insights into chapter 1 of his Gospel. The rabbis taught that the first point that they came across with was that the Word was the same as God, yet distinct from God. And John picks that up in John chapter 1, verses 1 and 2 as well. The rabbis also taught that the Word was the agent of creation. And John says that Jesus is the agent of creation in John chapter 1, verse 3. Thirdly, the rabbis taught that the Word was a person. It was not a force. And that's exactly what the Gospel of John says in John chapter 1, verse 3 as well. Fourthly, the rabbis taught that the Word was the agent of salvation. And we see in John chapter 1, verses 12 and 13 that Jesus is indeed the way of salvation, the agent of salvation. Fifthly, Rabbinic theology teaches that the Word is the agent of the theophanies, and that's what John says in John 1:14. Jesus came and he Shekinah. He was God visible in the flesh, the Shekinah form of the Shekinah glory of God, and he Shekinah among us. Sixthly, the rabbis taught that the Word is the agent of the covenants. John agrees in chapter 1, verses 15 through 17. And finally, seventh, the rabbis taught that the Word was the agent of revelation, and that's exactly what John says in John chapter 1, verse 18. What John is saying to us is that whatever the Bible says about Jesus, whatever the Bible said about the Word is true of Jesus the Messiah. Then we began to look at the genealogies, and I started by examining the cultural importance of genealogies, and I brought this point home by sharing a letter that a young Palestinian Christian wrote to me. He was an inmate in a California prison when I was doing prison ministry one weekend. And we became friends, we corresponded, and I lost track of him when he was transferred to another prison. But in his very first letter to me, he shared about his joy of meeting a Jewish person and having a Jewish person and his Lord as his Savior. And that was very important to him. And then he made this statement. He says, "Let me give you my bloodline so that by my custom you can know me." See, to my friend Yusef, his genealogy was extremely important. It was so important that I couldn't really know who he was unless I knew from whom he descended. And so then he gave me his genealogy. And that's the whole point of Matthew and Luke's genealogy. In Middle Eastern thinking, you truly know who the person is when you know their background, who they've descended from. Then we talked a little bit about the Davidic covenant. I taught you that the Davidic covenant is a subset of the eternal, unilateral, and unconditional Abrahamic covenant. The Abrahamic covenant is made up of 3 basic promises that are expanded and developed by 3 additional eternal, unilateral, and unconditional covenants God made with the Jewish people. The land promise is expanded and developed by the land covenant. The national promise is expanded and developed by the Davidic covenant. And the spiritual blessing promise is expanded and developed by the new covenant. And it is the national promise section of the Abrahamic covenant that is expanded and developed by the Davidic covenant, and this is our focus as we look at the genealogies. Let's take a look then at that Davidic covenant again just in summary, overview form. In the Davidic covenant, David was promised 4 eternal things, 4 eternal aspects to the Davidic covenant. David was promised an eternal house. This speaks of his dynasty, his family. His family would always provide a succession of kings. Secondly, he was promised an eternal throne. This speaks of his royal authority. He would always have royal authority. His family will always govern. Thirdly, he was promised an eternal kingdom. That is a reference to the nation of Israel. That is the nation over which he will govern. And finally, he's promised an eternal person. That eternal person, of course, is Yeshua, Jesus, who is the Messiah, who is the Lord of Lords and King of Kings. So there's the Davidic covenant. The most important part right now in our discussion is, again, dealing with the dynasty, dealing with the genealogy, dealing with this succession of kings and origin of the Messiah, the origin of Jesus the Messiah. What is his human origin? Well, we started with Matthew's genealogy, and we said that Matthew's genealogy was that of Joseph, and that the purpose of Matthew's genealogy is to show that if Jesus really was Joseph's son, he could not be king. Remember, the usual way of explaining the two genealogies is to say that Luke gives us the Messiah's real lineage, while Matthew gives us the Messiah's royal lineage, or something like that. A real, his natural descent, and his legal genealogy, things like that. And of course, when you're dealing with Jesus as the royal lineage, a statement is often made that Joseph is the heir apparent to the Davidic throne, even though the scripture does not state that. And because Jesus was his adopted son, and that is a second assumption, he would claim the throne through Joseph. But that's a very weak position, and I'm going to explain to you why as we move into the new material. So let's look at two reasons why this position that Joseph gives the royal lineage and Luke gives the real lineage is a weak position. So we'll start with the idea of adoption. The idea of adoption is on the bottom of page 21. Now, my first point. Adoption was not practiced in the Jewish community during the first century or before. And for this, I submit an article from the Encyclopedia Judaica, the CD-ROM edition, on adoption, the article on adoption. And in that article you'll read, the evidence for adoption in the Bible is so equivocal, that means vague, is so equivocal that some have denied it was practiced in the biblical period. Some have said it was absolutely could not have been practiced in the Bible. The evidence for adoption in the pre-exilic period, now by pre-exilic period they would mean before the Babylonian exile, pre-exilic. The evidence for adoption in the pre-exilic period is meager. The possibility that adoption was practiced in this period cannot be excluded, especially since contemporary legal documents are lacking. So it's pretty tough to go one way or the other on this issue. Nevertheless, it seems that if adoption played any role at all in Israelite family institutions, it was an insignificant one. There does not seem to be a lot of evidence for adoption at all. For the post-exilic period in Israel, and that's after the Babylonian exile, there is no reliable evidence for adoption at all. Zippo. That's the first century, and that extends into the first century there, the post-exilic period. Now, in Encyclopedia Judaica, under adoption, subheading later Jewish law, you'll read this, and this is on page 21 at the bottom of your outline as well. Here's what the article says. Adoption is not known as a legal institution in Jewish law. According to halakha, the personal status of a parent and child is based on the natural family relationship only, and there is no recognized way of creating this status artificially by a legal act or fiction. However, Jewish law does provide for consequences essentially similar to those caused by adoption to be created by legal means. These consequences are the right and obligation of a person to assume responsibility for A, a child's physical and mental welfare, and B, his financial position, including matters of inheritance and maintenance. So, what's the impact of this information? The importance of this information is the fact that Joseph could have easily assumed responsibility for Yeshua. Joseph was legally able to provide for Yeshua and oversee his physical, mental, and financial welfare as his guardian, not as his adopted father. In fact, anyone could have done that for Yeshua, oversee his physical, mental, and financial welfare as his guardian. But Joseph was chosen by God to do so. And being his guardian would not have qualified Yeshua for the throne of David through Joseph. No way. He had to be a direct descendant of Joseph to be considered in the Davidic line. Now, the second reason why this is a weak position is the fact that Yeshua had no claim to the throne if he was Joseph's son. If he was direct descendant of Joseph, he had no claim to the throne. Why? That's why Matthew starts out with the genealogy. He presents a certain problem, and he solves the problem with the virgin birth. Now Luke will have no such problem. He won't have anything to solve, to explain away. So he begins immediately with the virgin birth and waits until chapter 3 to give us the genealogy of the Messiah. So he's writing from a totally different perspective. All right, let's read Matthew chapter 1, verse 1. This is page 22 at the top of your outline. Matthew 1:1 is on page 20 of your harmony, or at least of my harmony. Section 3, Matthew 1:1. The book of the genealogy of Jesus the Messiah, the son of David, the son of Abraham. Now, verse 1 is an introductory verse. This is a summary phrase to connect the early events of the Messiah's life with the Jewish covenants. And there are 4 unconditional, eternal, and unilateral Jewish covenants in the Old Testament: the Abrahamic, land, Davidic, and New Covenant. We looked at that in more detail last week. Now here, 2 of them are in view. The phrase son of David connects Yeshua with the Davidic covenant. The son of Abraham connects him with the Abrahamic covenant. Now remember, the term son of David and son of Abraham mean descendant in this context. It's another way of saying descendant. It does not mean that Matthew is saying that Jesus literally was conceived by David or Abraham. He is a descendant of David or Abraham. Now in verse 3, Matthew mentions Tamar. Let's read verses 2 and 3. To Abraham was born Yitzhak, and to Yitzhak Yaakov, and to Yaakov Judah and his brothers. And to Judah was born Peretz, and Zerah by Tamar, and to Peretz was born Hetzron, and to Hetzron Ram. So Tamar is mentioned there. Now in verse 5, Matthew begins by mentioning Rahab, verses 4 and 5. And to Ram was born Aminadab, and to Aminadab Nachshon, to Nachshon Salmon, and to Salmon was born Boaz by Rahab. And to Boaz was born Obed by Ruth, and by Obed Jesse. So in verse 5 he mentions Rahab, and then also in verse 5 he closes by mentioning Ruth. Then in verse 6, Bathsheba is mentioned indirectly. Verse 6, and to Jesse was born David the king, and to David was born Solomon by her who had been the wife of Uriah. So that's a indirect reference to Bathsheba. So 4 women. 4 women are referred to, and 3 of these women, some think possibly all 4, but at least 3 were Gentiles. Ruth was a Moabitess, Tamar was a Canaanite, Rahab was a Canaanite. Bathsheba, though, I think was Jewish. More than likely she was Jewish, although some commentators would disagree. So Matthew is already pointing out that although Yeshua is King of the Jews, who came primarily for the Jews, the Gentiles will also benefit. He came primarily for the Jews, but the Gentiles will also benefit. Now, we must note, it's important to note that 3 of these 4 women were guilty of sexual sin. Rahab was a prostitute. Tamar was guilty of incest. Bathsheba, guilty of adultery. So the point of including these 3 sinners in the Messiah's genealogy is to stress that Yeshua came to save sinners. Yeshua came to save sinners. Now these ladies are all pre-Davidic ancestors of Yeshua. But these 2 points developed by breaking tradition are not the main point of the genealogy. I've shared this with you, but it's not the main point. The main point is no problems exist prior to David. But now we need to continue through Matthew's genealogy. Okay, we have Luke's genealogy on the left side and Matthew's genealogy on the right side. This is diagram number 1 on page 22 at the bottom. Now Matthew traces Joseph's genealogy beginning in verse 2 with Abraham, and he continues down to verse 6 with David. And we've read those first 6 verses. Then Matthew chooses one of David's sons. He chooses Solomon. Now David had many sons, but Solomon is the one to receive divine appointment. From Solomon, Matthew traces Joseph's genealogy down to verse 11 and to a man called Jeconiah. Okay, verse 11 is this is on page 21 of your harmony. Verse 11 reads, "And to Josiah was born Jeconiah and his brothers at the time of the deportation to Babylon." Then he continues down to verse 16, "And to Joseph." So again, on your harmony, verse 16. "And to Jacob was born Joseph, the husband of Mary, to whom was born Jesus, who is called Messiah," who is called Christ. Now in verse 16, Matthew tells us that Joseph was the husband of Mary, by whom was born Yeshua. Now, this is a very important little bit of Greek grammar for you. In the Greek language, we have masculine gender and feminine gender and neuter. If you're talking about males, men, boys, you would use the masculine gender. If you're talking about the feminine gender, women, girls, you'd use the feminine gender. All right? Now, the words "by whom" are feminine and refer to Mary, not to Joseph. Okay, this is chart number 1, page 22 at the bottom. On the left-hand column of your chart, you read, "To Jacob was born Joseph." So everything is masculine there because we're talking about 2 guys. But then we switch over to the right-hand side. "To Jacob was born Joseph, the husband of Mary." And now the rest of the phrase is in the feminine gender. "By whom," by Mary, "was born Yeshua, who is called the Messiah." He's not born of Joseph. What Matthew's saying is that Yeshua is a direct descendant of Mary. Jesus is not a direct descendant of Joseph. That's what that little bit of grammar tells us. Jesus was not the direct descendant of Joseph. Very important little bit of information. So, we're told that Joseph is a direct descendant of Jeconiah. And this is the crucial issue. This is the critical issue. And we see this in Jeremiah 22, 24 through 30. Let's take a look at Jeremiah 22, starting with verse 24. "As I live, declares the Lord, even though Coniah, the son of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, were a signet ring on my right hand, yet I would pull you off, and I will give you over into the hand of those who are seeking your life. Yes, into the hand of those whom you dread, even into the hand of Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, and into the hand of the Chaldeans. I will hurl you and your mother who bore you into another country where you were not born, and there you will die. But as for the land to which they desire to return, they will not return to it." Is this man Coniah a despised, shattered jar? Or is he an undesirable vessel? Why have he and his descendants been hurled out and cast into a land that they had not known? Land, 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 hear the word of the Lord. Thus says the Lord, write this man down childless, a man who will not prosper in his days, for no man of his descendants will prosper, sitting on the throne of David or ruling again in Jerusalem. All right, there's a curse pronounced on Coniah. This term Coniah, you see in the verse there, is a variant form of Jeconiah. And like my formal name is Robert, but you can call me Bob or Bobby in English. Those are variant forms of my name. So Coniah is a shortened form of Jeconiah. So we're talking about the same individual, even though the name has a different form. Now, because of the kind of man that Jeconiah was, Jeremiah pronounces a curse upon him. And the curse consists of the fact that no descendant of Jeconiah would ever have the right to sit on the throne on David's throne in Jerusalem. Now, we've been told by Matthew that Joseph is a direct descendant of Jeconiah. That's the problem. So Joseph was not the heir apparent to the throne of David. Let me repeat that. Joseph was not the heir apparent. He was under the Jeconiah curse. So if Jesus really was Joseph's son, he could not be king. If he was counted as Joseph's son in any way, shape, or form, he too fell under the Jeconiah curse and could not be king. You see, this Jeconiah curse cuts off Joseph and any descendant through Solomon, any descendant of David through Solomon, cuts off their right to the throne. Now this is why Matthew starts out with the genealogy. He has a problem to solve. A problem to solve. If Jesus is the king, why isn't he on the throne? Well, he solves the problem with the account of the virgin birth. The virgin birth tells us that Jesus was not born of Joseph. Joseph looked after his welfare, but he was not Yeshua's father, and that confused a lot of people. He was looking out after Yeshua's welfare. So many people assumed he was Yeshua's father. That's the problem. So while initially the Bible required for kingship a descendant of David, originally a descendant of David was required, but in Jeremiah's day, a descendant of David from the line of Solomon, the line was narrowed. Okay, you had to be a member of the house of David, but not from Jeconiah, not from Solomon, not from Jeconiah. So Matthew is saying that Jesus has no association with Jeconiah. Jesus is not part of Jeconiah's line in any way, shape, or form. So Jesus does not fall under the Jeconiah curse. All right, let's take a look at verse 17 in your harmony. Verse 17, it's on page 21 of your harmony. It's the left-hand column, final verse in the left-hand column. Therefore, all the generations from David to Abraham are 14 generations. From David to the deportation to Babylon, 14 generations. From the generation to Babylon, and from the deportation to Babylon to the time of Messiah, 14 generations. So Matthew gives us instructions on how to interpret his 14 generations in verse 17. And the key words, between the key words, and I've highlighted them on your chart in bold, we find 14 generations. For example, from Abraham to David, 14 in between there. David, down to the deportation of Babylon, there's 14 there. And the key word, deportation of Babylon to Christ or Messiah, 14 there. Now, a possible reason why Matthew chose the number 14 lies in the fact that the numerical value of the name David in Hebrew equals 14. There is David's name in Hebrew, David. Each letter in Hebrew has a numerical equivalent. So now I've spread out the letters to give myself a little bit more room. The Dalet has a numerical value of 4. The Vav, a numerical value of 6. The Dalet, a numerical value of 4. You add them together and you get 14. So this seems to be the symmetry that Matthew is interested in. He speaks of numbers of segments of 7. 3 segments of 7. Kind of similar to John. All right, let's summarize Matthew's genealogy. I just want to repeat this so you will you'll hear it again and hopefully understand what I'm trying to communicate to you more clearly. All right, Matthew is presenting Yeshua's genealogy in relation to his guardian, Joseph. Joseph is an honorable man. He's a good man. He has high character. He was a direct descendant of King David through David's son Solomon. However, Joseph was not Yeshua's father in verse 16. He is Mary's husband. He is Yeshua's guardian. And that's why he's important. He was given a great privilege and a great responsibility, but he is not the heir apparent to the throne of David. He is not the heir apparent because of the Jeconiah curse. Joseph had no legal right to sit on David's throne. And if Yeshua had been his son, then Yeshua would have been disqualified from the Messianic office by the Jeconiah curse. All right? And he presents this genealogy in a stylistic form, 3 sets of 14. So Matthew is saying by these 3 sets of 14, 6 sevens, my rendering of Joseph's lineage is a true and accurate and sacred account. It's harmonious, it's orderly, it's true, it's made up of 7s and 3s. Again, very similar to John. It reveals the truth that Joseph was not Yeshua's father. Again, Joseph was the husband of Yeshua's mother and the guardian of the Messiah, but that's all. He was not his natural father. He was not his stepfather. He was not his adopted father. But he was honored. He was honored by being the Messiah's guardian, and that is a great honor. But that's as far as it went. So the important result of all this that I've gone over and over again with you is the fact that Yeshua is not impacted by the Jeconiah curse. The Jeconiah curse does not concern Yeshua. It concerns Joseph, but not Yeshua. We'll talk about this in more in a little bit. All right, now on page 24, at the top of page 24, and we're looking at Luke's genealogy. We come to Luke's genealogy. Now, Luke follows strict Jewish law. He mentions no women, not even Mary, although it is her line that he is tracing. He skips no names. Symmetry is not his focus. His focus is historical accuracy. He shows that Yeshua could still be king because Yeshua was a descendant of David, but apart from the house of Jeconiah. He has no problem with Jeconiah. That's why he begins his gospel differently. Only later does he deal with the genealogy to show that Yeshua did descend from David. All right, section 3 of your harmony, Luke chapter 3, verses 23 and 24. We're on page 20 of your harmony, and it is the right-hand column on page 20 toward the bottom of the page. We'll start with verses 23 and 24. Being supposedly the son of Joseph, the son of Eli, the son of Mathat, the son of Levi, the son of Melchi, the son of Janai, the son of Yosef. Now, Luke's list of names is very, very unique. In Luke's list of names, all the names have the Greek definite article with the exception of the name Joseph. Now, this chart is on page 24 in the middle of the chart. All right, see on the left-hand column, Jesus being supposedly the son of Joseph, there's no definite article. There's no word the before Joseph's name. But after Joseph's name, every single name has a definite article. He's the son of the Eli, the son of the Matat, the son of the Levi, the son of the Melchi. Now that is fine, fine Greek. It's not very good English, but it's fine Greek. It's fine Greek. What is Luke doing? Luke is deliberately using this literary device to set off the name Joseph, to set the name Joseph apart. So what this tells us is a better way of translating the verse is to put a parenthesis around the phrase at the end of the name Joseph. So there, we've done that. You see that on my chart here? I've now encapsulated supposedly the son of Joseph in that phrase. That's a better way of reading it. Now the King James renders this phrase, being the son as was supposed. The NIV says, as was thought of Joseph. The NASB, of course, here, supposedly the son of Joseph. And all those words help emphasize the popular misconception. The misconception, misunderstanding of the time was that Jesus was the son of Joseph. See, that was the popular misunderstanding that Matthew especially is dealing with. Luke does it in this manner. Matthew does it in a different manner. But that's the misunderstanding. We'll see this pop up around again and again. So highlight this in your mind. Use a fluorescent yellow or menthol highlighter of some sort, because this idea is going to pop up again and again. This is the key issue that affects Matthew and Luke's genealogy. Everybody assumed apparently that Joseph was Yeshua's father. Current popular misconception. They thought he had a human father, a natural father, just like everyone else. They didn't think that Yeshua was adopted. They thought Joseph was his father. Adoption was not practiced in first century Israel. So we don't hear anyone saying, well, isn't Joseph his adopted father? No, they call him the son of Joseph. So they thought Joseph was his father. And again, if Joseph was his father, that would disqualify Yeshua from the throne. And if Yeshua cannot be Israel's king, then he cannot be Israel's Messiah. Now Matthew has just shown us that Joseph was not Yeshua's father, but that would raise a question. Well then, who in the world is his father? Now Matthew will answer that question with the virgin birth. God is Yeshua's father. All right? Another question would be raised. If Joseph is not his father, does Yeshua have a legitimate link to the Davidic throne? Now Luke is going to answer that question affirmatively as well. Yes, Yeshua does possess a legitimate link to the Davidic throne. Let's see how Luke proves this. All right, Jesus was a descendant of Eli, or rather he was the grandson of Eli. Okay, we're just pulled out the parentheses because parentheses is just some additional information. So the idea here is that Jesus being the son of the Eli. Now who is Eli? Well, he is Mary's father. He's Mary's father. Remember, Luke is following strict Jewish tradition. He's not mentioning women. Now, it is very possible, it's not unusual, I shouldn't say it's a minority case, but in Jewish writings of the first and second, let me reword that. It is possible, we're speaking of Mary now, it is possible that in Jewish writings of the first and second century, Jesus is referred to by the rabbis as the son of Eli. Now, John Lightfoot thinks, though, in his commentary on the New Testament from the Talmud in Hebraica. This is what John Lightfoot writes on page 55. He's quoting the Jerusalem Talmud, Hagigah, folio 77, 4d. He says, he's quoting Hagigah. He says, there is a discourse of a certain person who in his sleep saw the punishment of the damned. He saw Mary, the daughter of Heli, among the shades. Rabbi Joseph Bar Hanina said that the great bar of hell's gate hung at her ear. The point is, this person is seeing a lady named Mary being very, very, very severely punished. Well, more than likely, this Mary is the daughter of Heli, the same woman. They're saying that Mary, Yeshua's mother, was cursed and punished severely in hell. Now, Dr. Arnold G. Fruchtenbaum of our Ministries thinks that this Mary, the daughter of Heli, is a reference by the rabbis to Mary, the mother of Jesus. Other scholars disagree with that understanding. R. Travers Herford, in his book Christianity and the Talmud and Midrash, think that it is unlikely that this is Yeshua's mother. However, I know of no other Mary, daughter of Heli, who would be so reviled by the rabbis. So I think more than likely this reference to Mary, the daughter of Heli, in the Talmud is probably a rabbinic reference to Mary, the mother of Yeshua, and it is a way to revile her for her part in the birth of Yeshua and her relationship to Yeshua. Now, on one other point, it is not unique in Jewish systems to trace a man's origin through his wife. We have an example of that in Nehemiah 7:63, repeated in Ezra 2:61. And here we read, of the priests, the son of Hobaiah, the son of Hakkoz, the son of Barzillai, who took a wife from the daughters of Barzillai, the Gileadite, and was named after them. Okay. Here, a man's origin was traced not through his real line, but through his wife's line. And so that is a possibility in Jewish systems, in biblical systems. Now, this is because of strict Jewish law forbidding the mention of women's names in genealogies. Remember, Luke was following strict Jewish practice in the way he presents the Messiah's genealogy. He cannot mention Mary's name, so he mentions Joseph's name. But to show that he doesn't really mean Joseph, but Joseph's wife, he excludes the Greek definite article from Joseph's name and includes it with all the others. So he's telling us that he's tracing Mary's line, not Joseph's. So this is in keeping with the style of the entire gospel in that he tells us that the story is from Mary's point of view, not Joseph's point of view. Now Luke traces the genealogy in reverse order from Matthew. We're on page 24, chart number 1, the bottom of the page there. Matthew begins with his own time, and he traces backward, Luke traces the genealogy in reverse. Matthew starts with Abraham and goes down to Joseph, but Luke starts with Yeshua and works backward in time to Abraham and all the way to God. So in Luke's genealogy, God is a bookend at either end of the genealogy. And so God impregnated Mary. Mary gave birth to Jesus. And he can't mention Mary, so he mentions Eli. Now, when we come to verse 31, we come to Nathan and David. Verse 31. This is the bottom of the right-hand column on page 20 in your harmony. The son of Meliah, the son of Menah, the son of Mattatha, the son of Nathan, the son of David. The son of Nathan, the son of David. Now, Luke also traces the genealogy back to David. However, David had another son. Nathan, so we're going to add in Nathan at this point. There he is. David's line through Solomon ended with Jeconiah and the Jeconiah curse. This factor excluded Joseph and his descendants from sitting on David's throne. The reason this occurred lies in this principle, page 25 at the top. The Davidic covenant is unconditional for David. It will be fulfilled for David no matter what. It is unconditional for David, but it is conditional for Solomon and his descendants. All right, let me repeat that. The Davidic covenant will be fulfilled for David without question. However, the descendant through whom it will be fulfilled is conditional upon the obedience of that descendant and his line. Okay? Now, key statements usually not mentioned in regard to this are 1 Chronicles 22, 6 through 13, and 1 Chronicles 28, 7. In 1 Chronicles 22, 13, we get David's understanding of the Davidic covenant. David is reviewing the promise God made to him and charging Solomon to build the temple in verses 6 through 12. Then, in verse 13, David says this to Solomon: "Then you will prosper if you will prosper if you are careful to observe the statutes and ordinance which the Lord commanded Moses concerning Israel. Be strong and courageous. Do not fear nor be dismayed." So did you notice the conditional nature? Then if. So we need to ask ourselves, did Solomon obey the Mosaic law carefully? Well, the answer comes to us very clearly in 1 Kings 11:9. Now the Lord was angry with Solomon because his heart was turned away from the Lord, the God of Israel, who had appeared to him twice. So we learn that Solomon failed to diligently follow the Lord and was disciplined. Now in 1 Chronicles 28, David is again explaining his understanding of the Davidic covenant, and this is the middle of page 25 in your in your outline. His crucial statement is found in verse 7. Verse 7 of 1 Chronicles 28. David is quoting God. God says, he's quoting God, "I will establish his kingdom speaking of Solomon, I will establish his kingdom forever if he resolutely performs my commandments and my ordinances as is done now. So David, if your son goes on the same track, he goes down the same road that he's going on now, a road of obedience to my commandments, he's going to have his kingdom established forever. He's going to prosper. But he's got to continue. He can't swerve off the path. And notice the conditional element. If. So it appears to me that David understands that the Davidic covenant will be conditional in regard to Solomon. Again, did Solomon resolutely perform the Mosaic covenant? No, we just learned that in 1 Kings 11:9. We already read that verse. Now, here are verses, in 1 Kings 9:3, we have God's promise and warning to Solomon. Let's take a look at what God said to Solomon. We're on page 25 in the middle of the page. Here are verses 4 through 7 with my emphasis added. God is speaking to Solomon, directly to the incoming king. As for you, if you, Solomon, if you will walk before me as your father David walked, in integrity of heart and uprightness, doing according to all that I have commanded you, and will keep my statutes and my ordinances, then I will establish the throne of your kingdom over Israel forever, just as I promised to your father David, saying, you shall not lack a man on the throne of Israel. So notice the conditional nature there. But if you and your sons indeed turn away from following me, and do not keep my commandments and my statutes, which I have set before you, and go and serve other gods and worship them, then I will cut off Israel from the land which I have given them, and the house which I have consecrated for my name I will cast out of my sight. And so Israel will become a proverb and a byword among all the peoples. All right. Again, let's take a look at another verse. Again, remember the conditional nature in 1 Kings 9. If then, you have to, Solomon, your line will be blessed if you follow. Let's turn to Psalm 89, verses 28 through 37. I want you to add this to your notes, because this speaks to the same issue. Psalm 89, 28 to 37. Again, another assessment of the Davidic covenant. God says, my loving kindness I will keep for him, and he's referring to David here. My loving kindness I will keep for him forever, and my covenant shall be confirmed to him, to David. So I will establish his descendants forever, and his throne as the days of heaven. If his sons forsake my law, and do not walk in my judgments, if they violate my statutes, and do not keep my commandments, then I will punish their transgression with the rod, and their iniquity with stripes. David is promised the covenant, but not the sons. But I will not break off my loving kindness from him, David, nor deal falsely in my faithfulness. My covenant I will not violate, nor will I alter the utterance of my lips. Once I have sworn by my holiness, I will not lie to David. His descendant shall endure forever, and his throne as the sun before me. It shall be established forever like the moon, and the witness of the sky is faithful. Selah. Selah. So did you notice God's assessment of the Davidic covenant? Let me paraphrase this in our summary, middle of page 25. God will fulfill his promise to David of an eternal house, throne, person, and kingdom, but it will only come through Solomon's line if Solomon's line is worthy. It'll only come through Solomon's line if Solomon's line is worthy. Solomon's line was not worthy and was cut off conclusively with the Jeconiah curse. So a transfer of the covenant promise to another descendant of David is required. That's how this problem can easily be solved. And this is where Luke's genealogy comes into play. We already know that Solomon failed to follow the Mosaic covenant properly, 1 Kings 11:9. But did any other son fail as well? Well, a number of them failed to follow the Mosaic covenant. Following Solomon were 20 kings of Judah. Now, 12 of them were bad, 8 were good. Turn to the chart on the next page, page 26, and you'll see the list of the kings of Judah that came from Solomon. All these kings came from Solomon. But Solomon's line was disqualified and disciplined because most of them were bad. 12 of them were bad, only 8 of them were godly. And Jeconiah, the guy we're talking about, the one who was cursed, he was the 19th king. He was one of the worst. And so he was so bad that God pronounced the Jeconiah curse on him. And his successor, Zedekiah, did not prosper under Babylonian domination. Eventually he revolted, he was defeated, Babylon destroyed the city and the temple. So from 1 Kings 9, I'd say once again, the Davidic covenant is unconditional in regard to David. It cannot be revoked in regard to David. However, it is conditional concerning Solomon and his descendants. God will fulfill his promise to David of an eternal house, throne, person, and kingdom, but it will only come through Solomon's line if Solomon's line is worthy. Solomon's line was not worthy and was cut off conclusively with the Jeconiah curse. So a transfer of the covenant promise to another descendant of David is required. And this is where Luke's genealogy comes into play. He tells us that the transfer was made to another son of David. Now I hope I'm not harping on this too strongly, but this is a often misunderstood section of the genealogies, and I've just gone over it to try and cement it in your thinking. All right. The transfer was made to another son of David, but which one? Which one is divinely appointed? He had over 20 sons. We're looking at the chart on page 27. Now Jesus was a descendant of David, but from a different son. He was from Nathan. And here we have Solomon. There's Solomon, and notice, directly above him in line, he was born of Bathsheba. He's the firstborn son of Bathsheba. But what happened with Solomon? Solomon didn't make it. Solomon flaked out. He was disqualified. And so the kingdom, the promise, was transferred to another son. And here's Nathan. There's Nathan in the red circle. He is also a descendant of Bathsheba. The transfer is made to Nathan. There's no blood of Jeconiah running in the veins of Nathan. Consequently, there's no blood of Jeconiah in the veins of Jesus. Jesus was a member of the house of David apart from Jeconiah, so he could be king. So there's the transfer. Jeconiah curse to Nathan, to Eli. Eli is the father of Mary. Mary cannot be mentioned, and so it is God impregnates Mary. Mary gives birth to Jesus. He is in Nathan's line. There is the genealogy of the Messiah. This is the genealogy of this Messiah. This is his real genealogy, his royal genealogy, his legal line, and his natural line. All of it is right there. He is a descendant of David through Nathan. And so the Davidic covenant will be confirmed to him as well. You know, Nathan's not mentioned. Nathan is really hardly, he's only mentioned, I think, in one other place in Scripture. I don't know, he may be mentioned by name in other places, but let me confirm my radically different position here. You know, Nathan must have been a godly man. But notice what I said in Zechariah 12, 10 through 12. This is a reference dealing with the second coming. And we read in Zechariah 12:10, I will pour out on the house of David. So the house of David is in existence at the second coming. That means there's a descendants of the house of David with us today. I will pour out on the house of David and on the inhabitants of Jerusalem the spirit of grace and supplication, so that they will look on me whom they have pierced. They will mourn for him as one mourns for an only son, and they will weep bitterly over him like the bitter weeping over a firstborn. That's the second coming of Yeshua. And that day there will be a great mourning in Jerusalem, like the mourning of Hadad-Rimon on the plain of Megiddo. The land will mourn, every family by itself. The family of what? The family of the house of David by itself. And notice the next phrase. And their wives by themselves. And then the next phrase. the family of the house of Nathan by itself, and their wives by themselves. So what does this tell us? This tells us that the house of Nathan are going to be very prominent descendants of David at the second coming. He doesn't say the house of Solomon there, but he says the house of Nathan. You would think if the Messiah came through Solomon's line, then Solomon's line would be preserved, not Nathan's line. So this means that there are descendants of David through the house of Nathan alive today. And that again means that Luke's genealogy is the real and royal line of Yeshua. All right, I'm going to summarize this one more time. Be patient with me. We're at the top of page 28. Let's remember, point 1, that Yeshua was not the only descendant of David at that time. There were many potential Davidic claimants to the throne in the first century. In fact, long after the time of Jesus, in 70 AD, Vespasian hunted down and executed the house of David. He tried to root out the entire royal line because many claimants to the throne were still around. Of course, he did not succeed, but he tried. Because Vespasian was not interested in allowing a Davidic descendant to be proclaimed king. And we read about this in the book A History of the Jewish People in the Time of Jesus Christ by Schurer, page 279. Schurer writes, Vespasian, as well as Domitian and Trajan, is said by Hegesippus to have hunted for and executed all the Jews of the house of David with great rigor. Well, it's a difficult job. They didn't get them all, because there will be descendants of the house of David through Nathan alive even today at the second coming. But they hunted down the house of David with great rigor in order that the royal family on which the Jews rested their hopes should be rooted out. See what they wanted to do? That a Messiah descending from the house of David was expected is beyond dispute. The existence, therefore, of descendants of David might actually be looked on as a source of political danger. They get a Davidic king again, they'll rebel again. So we'll destroy all the Davidic kings. Now, ecclesiastical history, Eusebius Pamphilus, Eusebius writes on page 99 statements that correspond to this. It was also said that Vespasian, after the capture of Jerusalem, commanded that all the family of David be sought, that no one might be left among the Jews who was of the royal stock, and that in consequence another very violent persecution was raised against the Jews. So you see there were a lot of descendants of David around, so many that the Romans hunted them down. Of course, the Romans failed. God protected the house of Nathan, so the house of Nathan will be around at the second coming. But everyone else, or probably most everyone else, was hunted down. All right, fourth point. The important point right now is that Luke does give us the Messiah's genealogy, showing us that Jesus was of the house of David apart from Jeconiah, and therefore a legitimate claimant to the throne. He had a legitimate claim to the throne, no problem. His royal credentials were impeccable. You couldn't argue with his royal credentials. If they were not impeccable, he would have been easily dismissed as an obvious impostor by the religious leaders. So again, Luke's genealogy is both the real and the royal and the legal and the natural, whatever you want to call it. It's the genealogy of Yeshua in all its facets. But that does not solve the entire problem of Luke's genealogy. Why? We're on page 28 in the middle. Because claimants to the throne continue to emerge. Like I told you, the Romans didn't get them all. Even later, 135 AD, the leader of the Second Jewish Revolt, Bar Kokhba, is said to be of Davidic descent. Vespasian missed him and his parents. Also Trajan and Domitian, they missed some of these guys. Even in 1992, Rabbi Menachem Mendel Schneerson claimed to be of Davidic descent. There's Rabbi Schneerson. And this is why some of his followers, not all, but some of his followers called him King Messiah. Here's some of the stuff they put up, around in their Chabad houses. Mashiach, we want Mashiach. That crown with the word Mashiach underneath it, Do an act of goodness and kindness today. Moshiach is on his way. And they were saying, Rabbi Schneerson is on his way. He's going to reveal himself as the Moshiach. Again, not all of Chabad followed this, but very enthusiastic followers did. Well, the point is, he claimed Davidic descent, and so they could. So, at this point in Jewish history, there were a number of legitimate descendants to the throne of David on the scene. Of these other heirs to the throne, why was Jesus chosen above all the others? And this is where the element of divine appointment comes in. Remember, there are two requirements for kingship: Davidic descent, which we've just seen through Luke, and divine appointment. And we'll see that when Yeshua is conceived, the angel tells Mary that her child and none other is appointed to David's throne. Yeshua is the one appointed. All right, page 28 at the bottom of your outline, entitled 4 Titles. So on the bottom of page 28, there are 4 titles given to Yeshua in these 2 genealogies, and the titles present as 4 basic states. He's son of David, son of Abraham in Matthew 1:1, and in Luke 3:38, he's the son of Adam, the son of God. The term son of David shows that he is the king. The son of Abraham shows that Jesus was a Jew. The son of Adam shows that Jesus was a man. And the son of God shows that Jesus was God. So the titles portray the picture of the Jewish God, man, king. Now let me close this section with an amazing Jewish tradition I ran across. This tradition states that the Messiah will have no father. Here's the tradition. It's found in the book The Suffering Servant of Isaiah according to Jewish interpreters on page 33. It comes from the Breshit Rabbah of Rabbi Moshe HaDarshan, his commentary. Here's what we read. Says Rab Berechiah, the Holy One said, Yisrael, you have spoken before me saying, we are orphans and have no father. So Israel is complaining, we have no father. And then I've edited a little bit out to get to the key statements. The Redeemer I shall raise up, here's God's response, the Redeemer whom I shall raise up out of your midst will have no father also. And guess how this is substantiated? It's substantiated with 2 Messianic prophecies. It is said, behold the man whose name is the branch, and he shall branch up out of his place. Doesn't say out of Solomon's place or anyone else's place. Saying the Redeemer will have no father. That's according to the rabbis. Then Zechariah 6:12. And similarly by Isaiah, and he will come up as a sucker before him. Isaiah 53:2. Again, he will not come up out of a certain house of anyone, but he will come up as a sucker. Isaiah 53:2. So from these 2 Messianic prophecies, the rabbis developed the tradition that the Messiah will have no earthly father. And guess what? Yeshua has no earthly father. This is fully in accord with Isaiah 7:14 and the virgin birth. God alone is his father. There was no man involved in the conception of Yeshua. God is his father. He has no earthly father. And this is fully in accord with the New Testament genealogies. Yeshua's father is God. He is the God-man. All right, that brings us to the end of our time for this session. We'll pick it up next session, and we'll move forward in the life of the Messiah. We'll begin part 2 of your harmony by looking at the early years of John the Baptist. So thanks for being part of this session. Shalom, and we will see you soon.